Thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar on free, prior, and informed consent. I'm Krista West, Director of Learning here at ASI. Today we're going to talk about free, prior, and informed consent as it relates to the Performance Center Criterion 9.4. And this is a criterion that applies to all facilities in the ASI certification system, where the entity, that's the company seeking certification, shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources. And this applies anywhere where there's the presence of Indigenous peoples or their lands, territories, or resource is identified. Joining us today, we have Taylor Kennedy and Soledad Mills. Both are working on what free, prior, and informed consent means in theory and in practice, and we've been lucky to have them working with us over the past few months here at ASI. Taylor Kennedy is a Senior Program Manager at Resolv, an independent nonprofit that builds partnerships across sectors to develop solutions to critical social, health, and environmental challenges. Taylor's work focuses primarily on natural resource supply chains, including company-community relationships, Indigenous rights, artisanal mining, supply chain due diligence processes, gender equality, and sustainable development. We also have Soledad Mills, the CEO at Equitable Origin, who has spent more than a decade in corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, and socially responsible investment. At Equitable Origin, she is responsible for leading strategic planning, stakeholder engagement, and program development to deliver on EO's missions. So the material today that Sol and Taylor are presenting was presented several months ago at our Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum in India. And I felt it was so powerful, I asked them to repeat it here again for us today, and I'm so grateful that they have accepted. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Sol, just to start on our presentation.
Thank you very much, Krista, and thank you to ASI for hosting this webinar. Just to get us started, I'm going to cover a few slides about FPIC and then hand it over to Taylor, and then I will go into the Equitable Origin FPIC 360 tool. And to start out with a definition, this is the definition from the ASI standard. Free, prior, and informed consent is the principle that an Indigenous community has the right to give or withhold consent to proposed projects that may affect their land, natural resources, lives, and well-being. It's important to note that this is not just a concept applicable to mining. It's also incorporated in many standards that cover forestry, hydropower, solar development, palm oil plantations, etc. And we've been working on this project for the last year and a half with the ICL Alliance of Sustainability Standards to look at the coverage of FPIC across a variety of standards and sectors. So FPIC is a process of engagement and consultation between a company and a community with the aim of achieving consent of the community so that the project will go ahead. However, if the community chooses not to consent, that decision also needs to be respected. So if you want to think of it as if FPIC done properly is like somebody knocking at your door at home and asking if they can come in, and you get to choose whether you let them in or not. So what do the individual components of FPIC mean? We often call it by its acronym, but I think each of the components are extremely important to keep in mind. So the free part of FPIC means that there's been no coercion or manipulation or intimidation of communities to encourage them to agree to the project. Prior means that they've been consulted ahead of time, ideally well in advance of the project being implemented, and to allow communities sufficient time to use their own traditional decision-making systems to decide how and whether they want the project to develop. Informed is another one that I think is underrepresented in a lot of discussions around FPIC. The community needs to receive information that's relevant about the risks and impacts of the project in a way that they understand, whether that means in their own language or in a format that they can access. It's not just about publishing a 600-page environmental impact assessment on your website. And finally, consent is the ultimate goal of an FPIC process. If a community agrees to a project, it will be dependent on certain conditions or commitments that the company agrees to make. such as how a mine is rehabilitated or how benefits from the mine will be shared. And if a company doesn't fulfill those obligations, then a community can decide to withdraw their consent. So it's not a permanent one-off thing. It's something that is constantly revisited and involves continuous dialogue with the company. And to quote Mark Annandale, an ASI colleague, FPIC is about creating opportunities and I would say spaces for discussion to maximize Indigenous people's participation and gain some balance of power. It doesn't entirely resolve the rebalancing of power dynamic, but it goes a long way towards creating a platform for dialogue, exchange, and engagement between the community and the company to meet on a more level playing field. FPIC is not the same as consultation, although consultation is a necessary process to engage communities to seek their consent, but consultation on its own is not sufficient. A company can't just arrive to a community and provide information about the project and have people sign an attendance sheet and consider that as FPIC. Consultation is a two-way process. It should be a dialogue around listening and learning between the community and the company, and the community should play a central role in conducting and informing impact assessments, mapping their assets and monitoring the impacts of the project once it has started. It's not a negotiation, but there is a negotiation element in terms of the community giving consent under a set of conditions that are negotiated with the company. It shouldn't be a tick box formality. It's not something that can just be a one-off event, an agreement signed, and then FPIC is done. It's a continuous dialogue that allows communities to participate in every stage of the project and withhold consent if they're not in agreement with how the project is progressing. It's not an individual right. FPIC is a right under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and ILO 169. It's a collective right that involves collective community consultation, participation, and decision making. To start out with this project, we analyzed a variety of literature related to FPIC, including a number of standards in the ICL community and those outside of it, and a number of guidance documents, legal requirements, both international and national. And there's a huge amount of documentation on FPIC. It's a right that is protected in international human rights law. It's required by large international funders such as the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, and by association, any signatory bank to the Equator Principles. It's written into the national laws of some countries such as Australia, Peru, and the Philippines. And where FPIC is not included in national law, there's an emerging expectation globally that companies should take responsibility for conducting FPIC properly, even if the government doesn't require it or if the government hasn't fulfilled their obligation in upholding that right in that country. FPIC is under international law enshrined in the ILO Convention 169, which 22 countries have ratified, and countries that ratify it have to incorporate that into their national law. It's also included in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is now just a little over 10 years old, and I believe over 190 countries have signed on to that. The declaration is not binding in the same way that the convention is, but it does establish a societal expectation that countries who have signed it will implement it. In the UN Declaration, it emphasizes the right of Indigenous peoples to maintain and strengthen their own institutions, cultures, and traditions, and to freely pursue their development according to their own needs and aspirations. And finally, FPIC is included in a number of voluntary sustainability standards, many of which are part of the ICL Sustainability Standards Alliance, including ASI, Equitable Origin. You'll see also Forest Stewardship Council, Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials, Better Coal, Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, Responsible Jewelry Council, and Bonsucro. So these standards exist across a number of industries, and I think we're going to see an increasing need for FPIC, not just in mining, but in other energy and infrastructure development as well. And now I'll hand it off to Taylor, who will discuss how companies are working with Resolv on FPIC.
Thanks, Sol, and thanks, Krista, for hosting us today. Resolv is the Secretariat for the FPIC Solutions Dialogue, which is a group of companies, NGOs, and communities who all agree that FPIC is right for Indigenous communities. The dialogue works together to discuss how to implement FPIC in difficult situations, like when the government doesn't recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples or doesn't sufficiently recognize them, when there are a number of communities with traditional ties to the land, when it's not clear that everyone in the community has their interests represented, and so on. Members share current challenges or case studies from their work and talk about how they're approaching issues. They ask questions of one another, offer suggestions, and then we try to pull out sort of the lessons learned and tentative guidance that can be shared more broadly. This is the list of current participants. As you can see, it's sort of an amalgam of extractive companies. We have mining as well as oil and gas. There's also several organizations who are focused on human rights and conservation issues. We have a few networks of Indigenous folks. We also have seen our membership grow or change a bit in the 7 years since we started, but a lot of these organizations have been involved since the beginning. So I wanted to share some of the insights or the realizations that have come up in the dialogue's discussions, recognizing that many companies around the world are not implementing FPIC and that not every government is requiring it, probably most don't, but also want to point out that several companies do have policies about FPIC and are working to implement it. These insights from the dialogue can be helpful as you think about messages that you might want to take to companies working in your countries, or as you ask your government to seek better practices by industry. So first, it's important to recognize that FPIC is not something that happens just once. It is very important that companies seek consent at the beginning, but they should also seek consent before they seek to expand and for plans for closure and rehabilitation. Some companies may say that they are working on a tight timeline and that you have to decide now, but it's important to point out that while achieving FPIC at the beginning may take more time, it can help to establish trust and a good pattern for sharing information and taking decisions. That relationship can help later decisions to move more quickly, and if the community is in agreement with how the company is working, they are less likely to protest. It's certainly very expensive for companies when they have to stop operations because of protests. So really laying a good foundation of trust and cooperation is in the best interest of companies. Before signing agreements with companies, it's good to think about what you and your community need in order to fully understand the proposal for the project, as well as what that means for you. There are many things like legal advice, support for negotiation, also community-led impact assessments where communities do their own studies to look at what cultural impacts might be, possible negative environmental or social impacts, including impacts to important sites. You often know more about your environments than the consultants would, and having engagement by the community, possibly with help from an expert consultant, can actually help the company to plan to mitigate issues and manage risks for both the company and for the community. Communities don't always have the resources to fund these things on their own, but it is important to be able to access independent experts. So communities can ask companies to set aside funds and then let the community choose who gets hired. Often companies and communities develop agreements on how impacts will be managed and compensated and to establish other common expectations. These sometimes become just these huge Frankenstein agreements that are very difficult to alter later on or tweak in order to address how both company and community are changing, or to reflect the process that continues to evolve. So it may be helpful to think about having distinct sections or even separate agreements for each of these elements. So the first element is compensation. That's how communities will be compensated for the impacts that they experience. This could include relocation to new homes. It could also include money if you agree to some environmental or social impacts that aren't possible to mitigate. This could also include non-monetary things like schools or hospitals or livelihoods development, and so on. The second element is mitigation and management. These are commitments that the company is making to manage or to reduce, and impacts that the impact assessment identifies. This includes things like monitoring water quality and erosion, or it could include periodic evaluation of any healthcare or education services or anything else that's provided as part of the compensation package. So the third element is benefit, and this is about sharing prosperity. It could be royalties or money that's a percentage of production, which would vary based on how much is produced in the current market value. And then the fourth element is process. So how will we make decisions? When do we decide and on what? How will we handle conflicts? How will we raise concerns with each other? What is the process of monitoring other parts of the agreement? And what's the process? What do we do if we need to renegotiate some of these things? And especially having this fourth piece, this process piece, be its own separate agreement, makes it much easier to revisit as needed. It's important to plan for strong implementation processes and resources for everyone to meet the commitments that they are making. There can also be real value in having an independent monitor who may be able to flag differences in company and community perspectives and offer suggestions for where realignment might be useful or where issues need to be addressed. So I'll hand it now back over to Saul to talk about what communities should be looking for if FPIC is happening as it ought to be.
So as part of the project that we did over the last year and a half to develop the FPIC 360 tool, we conducted workshops with communities in Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador that included leaders of 15 different Indigenous peoples nations from the region. And we wanted to get their feedback on what they considered a successful or an effective FPIC process to look like on the ground. And we found that there was a gap of understanding between how FPIC is defined locally and how FPIC is defined in international standards and international law. So we found ourselves adjusting the format of these workshops to allow more time to bridge that gap and understand more what the decision-making processes were in these communities, and also to understand their expectations around how they would engage and what they would need to be able to effectively engage in an FPIC process. In some cases, the communities had been part of FPIC processes before, and in other cases, they had not. So what we found was that despite the fact that FPIC is included in many international standards and requirements, it can be difficult to monitor and verify when it's actually happening because of the mechanisms that these standards use for implementation and verification, which can be a one-off assessment or a verification activity that has a defined period of time, whereas as we discussed earlier, FPIC should be an ongoing process. The other challenge is that there's a lack of experience or knowledge of FPIC processes among communities, and companies also don't necessarily fully understand FPIC either, both at the regional and national regulatory level and at the international level, and in terms of a rights-based approach. And the other challenge that we wanted to bridge with this tool was the lack of evidence to show if and when FPIC is happening. So over the course of the initial stage of research, documentation research, and these workshops, we learned how communities document meetings and agreements, how they make decisions, and what they would expect from these meetings, agreements, and negotiations with the company. We learned how they share information as a community. We got some baseline information on the level of mobile phone penetration in these areas, and we learned from them what they would expect from a successful and meaningful FPIC process with a company. And the other challenge that sometimes happens in the company community dialogues is that the company establishes the agenda and decides when and where the meetings will be, what the agenda is, and what the allocated time is for questions, whereas in reality, FPIC should be a co-designed process where the communities can have a say in the formats of those meetings, the type of information they need ahead of time, and the capacity they need to fully participate. This is just to show the current iteration of the FPIC 360 tool, which is in Excel. And so we're using the results of the research that we did and the workshops to develop this tool into something that both communities and companies can use to manage the FPIC process. Communities can use this tool to educate themselves about what a responsible FPIC process should look like and ensure that they are prepared to engage. and identify their needs in terms of people, resources, knowledge, in order to participate effectively in that process. So it will ask things like, does the community have a system for making decisions collectively? What is that system? Does the company fully understand that system? Does the community have an appropriate representative who will liaise with the company and attend meetings on behalf of the community? Does the community have established methods of communication so the representative can communicate the information coming from those meetings? And does the community have enough technical knowledge about mining risks and impacts to make informed decisions, or do they need additional technical support? Similarly, it's just as important for the company to have a clear understanding of the profile of the communities they're working with and understanding their history, their rights, and their context, as well as having respect for their culture is very important to build trust between the community and the company. Now I'm going to hand it back to Taylor, who's going to talk a little bit more about Indigenous people's rights.
So we've tried to outline some messages or ideas for engaging with companies and governments in a constructive way, but wanted to also pull out some thoughts for what communities can do if their rights are not being acknowledged. And so here are a few things for you to consider. So first, it's important to be thoughtful about what risks there might be in taking any action, who might be at risk, and whether these are risks that you are willing to take. Second, knowing your rights is a very good starting point. There are a number of good resources online from different NGOs, and I'll share a few of those in a minute. You can also look for others who are working on similar issues in your country or region, and you may be able to share resources and expertise across communities. Civil society organizations working in your region may also be able to offer support or point you towards helpful resources. And then you can certainly look for legal precedents and organize legal action. Here are a few potential resources for communities. This presentation was originally given by myself and Emma in India for the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, and recognize that there are folks on the phone who may not be from communities, who may be from companies or governments. And so we thought this still could be a resource for you to know what sort of information is available for communities, and also to hear some of these important messages that are coming out of some of the leading folks working on FPIC, but are happy to take questions from a few perspectives in a minute. But just quickly going through these resources. So Oxfam has a guide for communities with information about FPIC and how communities can use it. These are in a number of languages: English, Dutch, French, Indonesian, Khmer, Lao, Mongolian, Papua New Guinea Pidgin, Portuguese, Spanish, Swahili, Tidum, and Vietnamese. They also have a trainer's guide in several of these languages to help those who are running FPIC workshops in communities. Forest Peoples Program has a link from their main page to a host of resources for communities, including for trainings in several countries. They also have publications on a variety of issues like the rights of Indigenous women and legal analysis from several countries. Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact has a million resources. They have a training manual on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People from 2013, and then there was a volume 2 that's published in 2016 that's quite helpful. Natural Justice has examples of community protocols from all over the world, from North and South America, from Asia, Australia, Pacific Islands, and from Africa. Mostly these are in English, but there are some in Spanish and Portuguese, and those can be really helpful templates for communities as they seek to articulate, what is the decision-making process within my community. And then Equitable Origin is also developing a compilation of information for communities. So I'll let Sol share a bit more on that now.
Thanks, Taylor. We are launching a resource hub on Indigenous rights that will compile resources in Spanish primarily, focused on Latin America, that will allow communities to search resources by type, by country, and by sector. Right now we're focusing primarily on Ecuador, and so the country level resources will be relevant to Ecuador. And it also includes court cases, relevant court cases from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and references to international laws, voluntary standards, and tools and other resources such as those mentioned by Taylor, but only if they're available in Spanish. So we have a prototype on our website that I invite you to visit. It's called Centro de Recursos under programs on equitableorigin.org. And we will eventually be launching this as a separate website from Equitable Origin and expanding it into a few other countries next year.
Thanks, Sol. So I think now we can take questions, Krista, wanting to go over to you in case anything has come in directly to you.
I do have a question kind of from my own side, Taylor, and I direct this one to you. But one thing is that even when companies are committed to FPIC, the implementation isn't always perfect. And I think there's always kind of a fear about, how that goes. But there could be varied outcomes for the community because of what comes into the agreements and the negotiation process. So from the community perspective, what can they do to prepare themselves to be better positioned for the best outcome?
Implementation definitely isn't always perfect, in part because folks are still learning what exactly does FPIC mean. There are a lot of questions about who really makes up the community. Do you just go speak to the chief or the traditional leader, or how do you make sure that that person is communicating with everyone in their community? What do you do if the government says, oh, there's only one Indigenous community here, when it's clear that there are several? And so people continue to learn. And also, FPIC is a relatively new principle. And so there are plenty of mine sites and development sites that have been in development for years, and companies really only starting to implement FPIC principles kind of midway. And so looking for opportunities to build from that. There's not really a perfect case study of FPIC from the very beginning all the way through closure. But that said, I think there's several things that companies can do to prepare themselves if they think that development is likely. And those would be things like identifying cultural and environmental assets, so doing historical and cultural mapping to agree on important sites within the community, and also the functions that surround land and the environment. Definitely developing clarity on how the company should engage with the community. So looking at those community protocols is probably a good start, and being able to articulate, what your decision-making process is and what that means for how the company should approach you, with what timing and with what sort of expectation about how you will reach and communicate your thoughts. Something else to think about is, what are the community's priorities for development? There will likely be some development investment if a company is committed to seeking shared value for the community. And you often see the communities think, okay, this is a great opportunity to ask for a lot of things, and it is, but I think it's important to prioritize and think through, okay, rather than asking for a bunch of things that might be done not perfectly, should we really focus on what matters most and what really needs to be done right? So it's important to your community to be thinking about development of livelihoods for youth. Maybe that's your number one priority, and focus the majority of development funding in the beginning on that. Or, there may be something like developing opportunities for direct sourcing by the company from the community, or developing small enterprises and so on. But just having a sense of what your overall development objectives are is really helpful, I think, in identifying the options and helping the company to prioritize which of its commitments are really important to you. Then it's important to remember, as I mentioned, that extractive development is a process, and there's a lot of uncertainty at the outset. So I think it's helpful to recognize that plans really crystallize later on. So at the beginning, it's important to just keep asking questions and understand what are the different things that might change, what are the variables, and then be thinking alongside those variables, what are the different options for the community, or what are the different priorities for the community, depending on the directions that the project might go in. So, if it's going to be a short-lived mine, you might have different priorities than if it's going to be there for 100 years, or if it's a huge, expansive, taking up a lot of land sort of thing. Then understanding that extractive projects don't live forever, I think it's useful, even at the beginning, to think about what your community would want to see after a project is closed, and bring those elements to the negotiation table. For instance, if there is already environmental damage from past projects in that area, it could be an opportunity for the company to do remediation beyond its own impacts. or, maybe the community would like to think about using some of the features of the mine site afterward, like the buildings. These could be used for community gatherings and so on. It's also really helpful to see what others have done. So to the extent you can, I think it's useful to talk to other communities or look into examples of different kinds of social and economic development projects that have taken place around the world, just to think about what's possible and what might work here. Resolv is working on a toolkit with information on different phases of a project cycle and pulling out some case studies on how FPIC principles were incorporated into the agreements and outcomes of that project phase. That will be out early next year, so keep an eye out for that too.
Just to follow up, Taylor, you had mentioned just at the beginning of that answer about community protocols. Is that available in one of the resources you listed on the last slide?
Yes, thanks. It's under natural justice. So yeah, here, the community protocols.
Right there.
Thanks.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear that we had that there. I'm going to hand it over to Fabio, who had a question.
In Brazil, during the license process, there is a special chapter for indigenous people and also for quilombolas people. They are ex-slaves communities in Brazil. And this process include a special assessment on impacts and risks and proposals of mitigations and agreement with them for indigenous and for quilombolas. Those process could be considered as FPIC or not?
Well, you may have better insight given your work in South and Latin America than I do on this particular agreement, but it sounds to me like that is at least informed consultation. I guess I would ask Fabio if that includes an option for communities to say no to the agreement, or if they're just sort of signing off on what the compensation is.
Normally, I don't know if they say no, which will be the consequence. What they see, they usually try to get an agreement or do repeatedly the process until have an agreement normally. But I don't know if they say no, which will be the consequence.
Yeah, I've heard. Oh, go ahead, Saul. You have more familiarity.
Not with Brazil specifically, but there are other countries in Latin America that include requirements related to the licensing process to conduct social impact assessments and commit a certain percentage of the project revenue to community investment, to conduct consultation with communities, to do stakeholder mapping, and to agree on MOUs or convenios with communities. But I think, to Taylor's point, none of that necessarily implies that communities have the option to say no, but those are components of the consultation and ultimately the consent process.
And I will add that, I've heard of policies in other locations where there is this effort to get an agreement, and that's written into law. But then but it's on a timeline, and if the company and the community aren't able to reach agreement within that, like, say 6 months, then the community doesn't get anything. So, sometimes there are stipulations like that just say that might incentivize the community to say yes, even if they don't want it, because they're afraid of the alternative would just be, having all of the impacts without any of the potential benefits.
So what I hear you saying is that we certainly can rely on government processes, but we have to ensure that they meet kind of all of the 4 different require of free, prior, and informed consent.
Government is an important tool as we think about implementation of FPIC, because really there are some things that government ought to be doing well before the company even shows up. Really it's the government's responsibility to go to a community and say, are you interested in development? And if so, will you consider some proposals or some exploration by a company who has expressed interest? But in the absence of government, which is quite common, this has fallen on companies to actually initiate those consultation and consent processes, but really the government ought to be there. And so where there is a method for them to be there, that's a good thing to try to build that capacity with an eye toward, does this really meet the real intention of FPIC, and is the government seeing the full picture? Definitely heard of some situations where, the government says, okay, to the company, you only need to talk to this one community because there's only one Indigenous community there, when it's apparent to the company that there's several who are Indigenous and would be impacted. So yeah, it's a tool, but not the only one.
Have either of you seen an FPIC report that demonstrates a successful process? And if so, is it publicly available?
Nothing comes to mind right at my fingertips, but I'm sure we do have that, so we can follow up. There was one that's we've been kind of co-presenting with some of the people who were involved in it in Nepal in an IFC hydropower project, but I don't think it's been written up into a case study, but it has been presented as a successful case study in a number of fora, including with the Indigenous representative, with the consultant, and with the IFC and World Bank, to show how well this process went. And I think the intent is to develop that into a case study eventually. But it's definitely very interesting to look at all the components that made it successful. And it was also done fairly recently, last year, I believe. And so we've been on panels with those people and have heard that case study as a positive example.
I think that there's a fair amount of examples. We talk about an FPIC process, and that can mean a couple of things. There's FPIC throughout the life of a project. And if you refer to that as the process, I don't think that there are any case studies at all, because FPIC just hasn't been in practice for that long. And also people haven't really been thinking about it as methodically. There, I think, are many case studies where people have employed FPIC principles at some stage. So, for instance, I'm thinking about Newmont in Suriname. They originally acquired a mine from a different company who had not confirmed FPIC. And so the Marion mine, began without consent, but the Newmont developed a relationship with the community and started understanding the context. They, began understanding some of the communities who were impacted. And as they started thinking about expansion, well, it's not actually expansion, it's a few nearby sites. They determined that we want to implement FPIC principles at these sites. And so for the second site, which began a bit later, they insisted that the government be present and participate in some of these consent discussions with the community. And so we're trying to really build the capacity of the government there. And then for the third site, they actually said to the government, look, we're not even going to seek an exploration license until there has been some sort of consent process for that exploration license. And so we have a short write-up of that that's not public yet, but will be included in the toolkit that we're developing. It certainly could put you in touch with folks who could share a little bit more about that. But part of that third piece too, there was a real effort, including with a member of the IPAF, Marie-Jose Ortiz, who led an independent community mapping project in Suriname to identify all of the cultural and historic resources that were really important to the community, and think through what kinds of impacts there might be. So that, I think, is a good example of companies sort of learning and starting to bring in new approaches to FPIC, but where you might say, well, consent wasn't achieved at the very beginning, so it's not FPIC. So
how do you measure consent, and how do you know that you do have consent, and who are you getting it from?
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges that our tool is trying to bridge. And so at the foundation of it, the tool conceives of FPIC as a process. So we're not just looking to verify one point in time.
Yeah.
It's designed to measure the full cycle of consultation and consent throughout the project lifecycle. So it's a little different than a conventional certification or audit approach, and it's designed to capture and assess compliance with FPIC over more than one point in time in the continuum of the process. So in order to do that, the tool includes a number of preconditions that are required before an FPIC process can be undertaken by a company or a government. And one of the key issues that must be considered during the pre-dialogue phase is the role of communities, Indigenous, marginalised and vulnerable groups, in order to ensure that the people who are involved in the FPIC process and who are chosen by the community to represent them in the dialogues with the company or the government are committed to representing the interests of all the members of their community and not just certain components of those. And if that's done correctly, then FPIC does have a bigger potential to empower those members of communities that are often marginalized and facilitate the participation in the decision-making process about the future of the community and the development or not of their resources. But it's challenging even in community consultation. So it's not just about Indigenous peoples, and there are lots of guidance documents out there that are designed to help companies and communities engage in an inclusive consultation and dialogue process. Whether or not that dialogue is intended to seek consent, there are the same issues around inclusion. But this component of the FPIC tool, I think it shows how we're trying to take a holistic approach, and we want to continually emphasize that consent must be obtained from a community that's well represented, as well as properly prepared, and that they're fully knowledgeable of their options, including the potential costs and benefits and risks of the project. So having that iterative approach allows the tool to monitor and verify the consent process from the initial contact with communities throughout the life cycle and at any point in between. So it doesn't only have to be applied at the very beginning of the project. And it can be easily adapted to apply to projects at varying stages of implementation, as well as different community and environmental contexts and different industries under the broad umbrella of large-scale natural resource development. So I think it comes back to the definition of FPIC. It's not only about the community deciding whether to give or withhold consent for a project to go ahead, but it's also a continuous process. There are decisions being made constantly within the project that may have an impact on Indigenous peoples or their resources or their land or their livelihoods, and all of those decisions need to be taken in consultation and with consent of communities, not just the initial decision to develop. So I think that's why we have a slightly broader definition of FPIC, because usually we are looking at projects that are already live. And I think in the case of certification systems, especially voluntary standards, usually those standards are coming in when the project is already in development or in operation.
In the modern world, it's not often that a project is starting afresh and anew, right? So I think there's a lot of benefit to be gained if we can have FPIC at different parts of the process as a continuum versus a point process that happens just at the beginning. You just can capture so much more. I will thank you so much, both of you, Taylor and Sol, for taking the time out of your day again and all of the time in advance to prepare for this. And I look forward to having an ongoing discussion over the years as we continue to evolve the FPIC process.